Hello, my name is Adam and welcome to the Lead Realm. Thank you for joining me on my journey to paint the models of my youth. This channel is both a diary of my progress and also my way of documenting my painting process. In this video, I'm going to be continuing work on my new undead army for the Rise of the Doomlord 4th and 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battles scenario. In the last video, I established my general painting scheme for the skeletal regiments, and will be carrying that on today with the Skullchuckers, or Screaming Skull catapults, depending on your vintage. As mentioned in the previous video, these were originally sold as part of a set that included some metal chariots and a few named character models. I will be painting the chariots in another video, and the rest of the models feature in my wider undead army, but are not part of the Doomlord army list. Each Skullchucker includes 3 crew, as well as a small pile of skulls to chuck. Despite the fact the original was intended to sit on the battlefield sans base, personally I like to build my artillery with bases, partly for a bit of visual storytelling, and partly for gameplay and presentation reasons. The bases I'm using are Games Workshop chariot bases. I cut holes into them, which were then lined with hot glue and a piece of styrene sheet covering the entire bottom of the base. This enables the crew bases to fit sunken into the larger scene, but still be removable to indicate damage, or be left behind if the catapult is destroyed. I wanted to build the bases up a little so that they don't seem so flat. I do this by putting down some layers of hot glue. While looking rough at this stage, once they are covered in ground texture, they should hopefully look okay. I also add some 3D printed skulls and larger rock formations using some smashed up slate which I liberated from my garden. Everything is seated in place with a few drops of superglue. Just as before, I'm starting from an undercoat of Wraithbone spray, topped up with Screaming Skull, to which I then apply a wash of Skeleton Horde contrast, obviously focusing on the bone areas of each model. The bottom part is then given a coat of Garagax sewer. As I mentioned in the previous video, this is to bring focus to the top of the model and give the illusion of the lower half being dirty or more aged. I'm aware that a good chunk of this army is going to be painted with the same paints using the same methods, so I won't be narrating the same information during each video. However, I will show on screen the paints I'm using during each step, and if you're interested on exactly what I'm doing, please feel free to check out my first video in the series for more information. These are pretty old models now, dating from the late 80s, and in some places are starting to show their age. While characterful and fun, some of the details are quite soft, and sometimes it's challenging to discern exactly what part of the models are supposed to be what. Personally, I tend to take some liberties when it comes to the details. Rather than looking at what others have done with their painting, I take my best guess as to what something might be and paint it accordingly. Ultimately, these models will mostly be looked at from a tabletop height, so a lot of the finer details get lost anyway. Busting out the big dry brush, it's time to highlight. A couple of good passes with the dry brush really works wonders with these models, not only building up an initial layer of paint that can be built up from, but also highlighting and sharpening some of the softer details. You could leave the bone at this stage, but I think going back with the brush to smooth out some of the larger flat areas results in a nicer final effect. With a final highlight of white with the brush, that brings us to the end of the bone steps for the crew and catapult. Here's how everything looks at this stage. Next, it's time for us to add a bit of visual interest and break up the monotony of the bone. These models have a new element for the army, chainmail. Just like the other metals, I want to go with a rough, non-metallic look, so I start by base coating everything in storm vermin fur, a slightly warm off grey. I always find chainmail a tough texture to paint. It rarely looks accurate, and it's tough to add weathering without having it all settle in the gaps between the links, which I think need to remain dark to show the texture of the material. Another new material, some tattered cloth, which I base coat with Phoenician purple. The reason I've moved on to a new colour before finishing the previous one is because I plan to wash both areas with Null oil, and having them both base coated at the same time means I can wash both and not worry about ruining already painted details. Time to highlight the chainmail. I mix some white scar with the storm vermin fur and try and place some light, almost dry brushed highlights in areas that might catch light, and to add some definition to the edges and areas of texture. I gradually add in more white until I'm using pure white on the very edges. I'm not 100% if this looks like chainmail, but it will do for now. Next, I start work on the purple fabric. I think that purple is going to be the accent colour for the army. It contrasts nicely with the green that features on the metals and bases and looks suitably regal. So when it comes time to paint some characters, I think using more purple will really help them stand out amongst the bone and grey, but still feel unified with the rest of the army. The purple is highlighted by mixing in some Rakarth flesh, again gradually adding more and more until a very final fine highlight of pure Rakarth flesh. Exactly the same as the previous skeletons, all the non-chainmail metal is given a coat of Mournfang brown, which will then be highlighted up through Kislev flesh and eventually white scar. I start by laying down the rough shapes of where I think the highlights need to sit. The transitions between them are harsh at this stage, but give me an idea about how it will look in the end. Once I'm happy with the placement of the highlights, I go back and wet blend between the colours and try and get them looking as smooth as possible. To add some weathering, a watered down precise wash of jade green is added. This was a technique I picked up many years ago, before such tools as Dirty Down existed. In fact, it was the effect I used on my very first undead army in the early 2000s. bringing it back for this army feels like me creating a link between my younger self and now. While these might not be the exact same models I had before, I like to think of this army as a spiritual successor. It was at this stage that I decided I didn't like the look of the wheels on the Skullchucker. They didn't look as good as the skeletons with the darker contrast paints at the bottom. So I decided to repaint them using a mix of Balor Brown and Garagax Sewer, highlighting up to pure Balor Brown. Perhaps these are made of the bones of a different animal, or maybe they are old rotten wood. All leather and rope is given a coat of Doomlord brown, which is then washed and highlighted just like before. The final step in painting is a couple of decapitated heads that hang from the Skullchucker. I used this as an opportunity to test out a zombie flesh scheme. Starting with Rakarth flesh, I then wash it with Plague Bearer flesh and highlight back through Rakarth flesh up to white. Honestly, I'm not very happy with how these turned out, or at least I don't think they'll look very good on larger models with more visible flesh. But that's why a small-scale test like this is useful. I'll spend some more time testing out different schemes before I get to the unit of zombies that I need to paint for this list. With the painting done, it's time for basing. The same method as before, the only difference is that due to the size of the chariot base and the little details that I need to avoid, I decided to apply the sand in stages. Once the glue is dry, I paint the bases in the same way as before. I may go back and pick out the slate in a slightly different colour, just so that it stands out a little more, as I feel it gets lost at the moment. I also pick out the skulls that were added to the base, painting them in the same way as the rest of the bone. Finally, I paint the edges of the bases black, as well as the empty holes underneath the crew. Since these models are metal, I give them 2 coats of gloss varnish through my airbrush before a final coat of ultra matte. After adding a few grass tufts here and there, we are done. Here we have the completed units, 2 Skullchuckers and their crew, ready to sow terror and destruction across the battlefield. Overall, I'm happy with how these turned out. As with most army projects I do, there have been some learnings, and with each unit, I feel there are things that I like and I'm happy with, and others that I might try revising for future models. But for now, let's put these into the cabinet with their friends. Next up on the painting desk are more skeleton units, both the skeleton horsemen and crossbow-armed foot soldiers. Once these are complete, that marks the end of the skeleton units in this army, except for the chariots. And I can move on to something new, perhaps either the zombies or some characters. If you have a preference as to what you would like to see me paint after the skeletons, I would love to hear it in the comments. But thank you for joining me in this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching me paint these trebuchet terrors. Hopefully they will enable my army to get ahead in battle. Stay old school and long live the lead.